Hey, bio students. Um, since we've already talked about viruses, which are not alive and not in one of the five kingdoms, it's now time to jump into those five kingdoms and look at each one in a little more detail. And the first one we're going to start with is probably the simplest organisms, but also some of the most successful and oldest organisms on Earth, and that's the bacteria. When you look at the name of the kingdom, it's not going to say bacteria, it's going to say Monera Kingdom because that's the name of their kingdom. They are, compared to other things, fairly simplistic on the inside, but that doesn't mean they're not effective in what they do. If you look at a bacterial cell compared to, say, your cell as an animal cell or a plant cell, like from a tree, you can see that there's not a whole lot going on inside the bacterial cell compared to ours. Now, they do have DNA on the inside, and they do have some little organelles that can build proteins, and they've got a few other little things going on chemically on the inside of them. But what you won't find on the inside of a bacterial cell are nucleus, mitochondria, chloroplast, endoplasmic reticulum, Golgi bodies, all of those cell parts that you've studied before that are on the inside of your cells are not going to be found on the inside of a bacterial cell because they're an older type, more simplistic type of cell called a prokaryotic cell. Your cells and plant cells and fungus cells and protist cells are all eukaryotic cells, and they do have those cell parts. So there's one big difference right off the bat. Now, another big difference comes in when they make copies of themselves, when they reproduce. It does not take two bacteria to make more bacteria because they're not reproducing sexually. They're actually reproducing asexually, which means without a partner, right? And they're doing it simply by splitting in two. Now, you're going to see this again later on in the semester because your cells do a very similar thing when they divide. But when we see it in bacteria, we call it binary fission. And if you break down that word, binary means two parts, and fission means to split. So it literally means to split in two. And that's all that's really happening. Inside the bacterial cell, here's the original guy, and it's got a little circular strand of DNA, and all it does is make a copy of that DNA so that both cells know how to be a bacteria, and then it just splits in two. And then you've got two bacteria where there were one. Now, they can produce differences in the split apart little bacteria because sometimes there are mutations in that DNA. So it's not like they stay the same forever. They can change. But it's a very fast way to reproduce. And that's one of the reasons that some bacteria causes so much trouble. Now, not all bacteria are bad. As a matter of fact, you couldn't be here now without certain bacteria that live in your body. You need your digestive system, your skin needs to cooperate with good bacteria. So there are bacteria that you need and have living inside your gut that help you digest your food. And some of those can be found in some of our foods. Some yogurts contain good bacteria that's actually good for you to have a lot of inside your gut. It helps you digest things. It helps regulate your digestive system. And if you've ever had a run of antibiotics, which will kill bacteria, the doctor might tell you when you're done with that to eat some yogurt. Because when you're trying to kill off bad bacteria, like from a sinus infection, it's also pretty easy to kill off the good bacteria in your gut, which can cause stomach problems. But if you eat some yogurt that contains that bacteria, and some yogurts are made specifically with a lot of that bacteria in them just for digestive health. So those are actually good for you and pretty tasty. Another type of bacteria that we wouldn't have most of our garden food if it weren't for is nitrogen-fixing bacteria. You see, there's nitrogen in the air, and there's also nitrogen in your muscle cells, in meat. But you can't get that nitrogen from the air. And the plants actually can't get that nitrogen from the air either. We can't breathe that in and take it into our bloodstream. But what can take that nitrogen in and turn it into a fertilizer, a solid form that the plants can take in and then you can eat, are nitrogen-fixing bacteria. And they live on the roots of these plants. and they'll take in the nitrogen from the air that's mixed in with the soil, and they will convert it into a fertilizer, a nitrate fertilizer. And then the plants take that in. And then when you eat the plant, or maybe a cow that ate the plant, then you can build your muscles because you're getting that nitrogen that the bacteria stuck in that plant. So if it weren't for those, you wouldn't have any muscles on your body. It'd be pretty hard to play sports if you didn't have that. Now, I also don't want to make it sound like that all bacteria are good. There are some that you need to avoid. One of them happens to be botulism. And this one is one that can get into a dented can at the grocery store. If there's a small hole that's made by the dent that was put in that can, and this botulinum toxin, the little bacteria, gets into that hole, and then that hole seals itself back over when the soup or whatever it is dries in that crack, then that food can become contaminated with botulism. That's food poisoning. And I'm not talking about a little bit of an upset stomach. I'm talking about put you in the hospital. You can poop yourself to death with too bad of an infection with botulism. So when I find dented cans in the grocery store, I don't leave them on the shelf. I set them in the floor because the grocery store shouldn't even have those on the shelves. They should be taken out of circulation. Also, if your parents or your grandparents can food and they're in little jars like this, the top on those jars have a little metal piece that kind of pops up and down if you poke it with your finger. If you poke that top with your finger and it pops up and down, that means that jar wasn't sealed properly and you shouldn't eat that. When you poke that top, it shouldn't move. So that's one to watch out for. Now, the weird thing about this is, though, that botulism toxin is exactly the same thing that some movie stars are injecting into their faces to get rid of wrinkles. That botulism toxin will paralyze the muscles in certain areas of your face and skin. And when those muscles are paralyzed, they can't contract and cause wrinkles. So it gives the appearance of not having as many wrinkles. Now, you don't have as much facial expression anymore because your face is kind of partially paralyzed, but it does kind of get rid of wrinkles. And what you're doing is injecting small amounts of that food poisoning bacteria into your face. And if done properly, it's fairly safe. I don't know about that, though. I mean, I know I'm getting old, but the idea of injecting food poisoning bacteria into my face to look a little better, I think I'll just look old. Now, there's another one that you need to be aware of that also has to be sort of in a sealed area, and that is tetanus bacteria. Now, if you get a cut on the outside of your skin and it's open to air and oxygen can get to it, then you probably don't need to worry about tetanus. But if you get a puncture wound, if you step on a nail or something like that and it goes into your foot, and then when you pull the nail out, that wound seals up and there's a cavity up in there that the nail created, then tetanus bacteria that could have been on the nail or anything. I know a lot of people think it's just metal nails, but it could be on a piece of wood. Anything that punctures your skin and leaves a hole, then or leaves a canal up in your foot or arm or whatever, it can have that tetanus bacteria on it and cause a very bad disease that will eventually cause all of your muscles to seize up, and it kills you if you don't get it treated. Luckily, we have a vaccine for tetanus that you can get beforehand just in case you want to be safe. And if you're working like construction jobs or something like that, you should probably get it every few years. But you can also get that tetanus shot after you've stepped on the rusty nail, because that bacteria is actually very slow growing, and the vaccine will be able to develop immunity to it even after you've stepped on that rusty nail. But that's one to be aware of. The other one I want to tell you about is another one that you should probably be aware of living in the area that we do, and that is Lyme disease. Now, I know that a lot of people mistakenly think that the disease comes from the tick that bites you, but that's not actually true. It's a bacteria in the tick's mouth that gives you Lyme disease. It's not the tick making you sick. It's the bacteria in the tick that makes you sick. Now, most of the time, a tick bite is not going to give you Lyme disease, but you do need to be careful, because very rarely, after you've had a tick bite, and if you do, you need to get a pair of tweezers and some rubbing alcohol or some kind of liquid that can sterilize things. In a pinch, even mouthwash would work. But you've got to pull that tick out and make sure you get the head out as well. Don't grab it by the rear end, because you'll just squeeze the blood that it's already sucked out of you back into yourself. But pull it out by its head and then really get in there and scrub that area well with rubbing alcohol or something to sterilize that wound. And then watch that bite mark for several days. If a red bullseye rash appears, you need to go to the doctor right then, because Lyme disease can be treated if it's caught early. But if it's left to multiply inside of you, it can cause much worse problems later that are way harder to treat. So if you do get a tick bite, it's probably not going to be a big deal, but watch that spot. If you see a bullseye rash like this show up, get yourself to the doctor. All right. The lesson today is about bacteria. You're going to be telling me a little bit about some bacteria that you found and making a wanted poster out of them. And I'm interested to see what you dig up, because I've presented you a few bacteria that I know about, and keep in mind, you can't use those for your project today. But I don't know about all the bacteria out there, and there are so many different types that I'm interested to see what you dig up. Okay, we'll see you later, guys. Good luck.